The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is The Spacious Way of Jesus.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson, and we are actually now on episode 265. I have a guest in the studio that I've been talking to over the course of the past few months. She's got a busy schedule because she's the author of 6 books, one of which is very soon to be released. Some of the titles are Surprised by Paradox, Keeping Place, A Habit Called Faith, and then 2 award winners, including Teach Us to Want and In Good Time. Her upcoming book is A Rule for the Rest of Us. She has an MFA in literature. She's also got a degree in French, and she is a consultant, a mentor for writers. She has a popular Substack called Monday Letters, and we have a very interesting conversation planned. Welcome to the studio, Jen Pollock Michel.
Thank you, Wade. Great to be here. Here, as in, on the computer.
In the virtual world, right?
Exactly.
So where are you actually dialing in from?
I am talking to you from Cincinnati, Ohio.
And I'm up here in a very beautiful, sunny Wisconsin as we record this show in early June. So as we always like to do on the show, we like to get to know the real you by hearing your own story, which in your case is very appropriate given your focus and subject matter, and how those stories shape us and how the audience's perceptions are shaped by learning that story. So tell us a little bit about your early life, your parents, where you were born, and the forces that shaped you before you took conscious adult thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again for having me. I was born in Indiana, but I lived sort of all over the Midwest and a little bit in the South when I was growing up as a child. My dad was a high school teacher. So this is kind of a fun part of my background. He was an English teacher and decided to go back for his PhD in communications. So we followed him as a family to, some educational stops and then to some first professorships. So I would definitely say that my mom and my dad were readers and actively encouraging me to read, and even my dad to write. He was the kind of dad and father and husband who would write poems for your birthday, usually mostly for my mom. But, I remember even just like my senior year of high school, wrote me a long letter. So words were just a part of our family, which isn't to say that I necessarily exactly saw myself where I am today, but it is fun to kind of look back and see some of those early seeds, I guess, of writing and reading. I was raised in a Christian family, so grateful for that. We were at church all the time. It was the days of like, you go Sunday morning, Sunday evening, you go Wednesday evening, you go to the youth group events if they're on Fridays or Saturdays. So we spent a lot of time at church. I spent a lot of time, learning the Bible when I was a kid, being in sword drills and, finding Matthew 5 very quickly and stepping forward in the line because that's where the Sermon on the Mount was. But I was one of those kids. I would say in my early childhood, I was like, yep, Jesus is real and Jesus is great. But then as an early teenager, like I will follow Jesus when my life has to naturally be boring. I think I had just a very typical sort of early teenage experience of like, I want to experience the world, I want to have fun. And it's not that I don't believe in Jesus. I just find, I think I would prefer to follow him when I'm like 30. And I think it's interesting to think about, the first moment of adult conscious thought, because I really do think it actually corresponds to my conversion to true personal faith in Jesus at the age of 16. I was attending a church. My youth group was going to camp. In fact, I was working at a dry cleaners, and my non-Christian friends with whom I worked at the dry cleaners, I just happened to offhandedly tell them about youth camp, and they were like, "Well, you should go, and we'll cover your shifts so that you can go." And I went, and not really necessarily thinking that was going to be a life-changing moment, but it really was, and it was very simple. It wasn't really an emotional talk that anyone gave. It really was an encounter, I would say, with Jesus, in a quiet moment, hearing him ask, I think, the questions that he puts to the early disciples. What do you want? Where are you headed? And will you follow me? And I think I just, knew. I mean, it was like, spiritual illumination. The scales fall off your eyes, and you sort of realize what I'm doing now is not really what's satisfying me. I think about the psalmist who says, you make known to me the path of life. In your presence, there's fullness of joy. And I think I was chasing a lot of pleasure, but because I was just sort of like that prodigal kid of like, go to church on Sundays and, live the rest of the week as you wish. But just knowing that wasn't really satisfying. And so that's sort of me up until the age of 16, I guess I would say.
Well, thank you. I'd like to unpack just a couple of aspects of that. One is you mentioned two things which are a little bit in conflict. One is that the 16-year-old experience at camp was transformational, but then still as you emerged into full adulthood, it was like, let's put that on hold because it's boring, right? So I want to just sit with that for a moment in the context of, was it the fact that church and the way that religion is presented is maybe a bit narrower than the fullness of life as God intended?
That's a great question. Well, I probably didn't tell the story exactly correctly. 16 was the moment when I up until 16, I would say 14, 15, 16, just really thinking like, I will come back to Jesus when I'm 30. I don't want to follow Jesus. I think he's real. I actually think all of the claims that he makes are true. I just don't, my heart's desires are not aligned with the call of Jesus until that moment that I described. But why, why did I think that? I think that's a common misconception. I think part of it is growing up in a tradition that, was fairly rules based, I guess, which is sort of interesting that I'm writing a book with rule in the title. But I think it was really an idea that faith was about restriction. It was about the things you couldn't do, and that would be ultimately good for you into eternity. But I couldn't lay hold of a goodness beyond, kind of like heaven. And I think it was truly, whether or not that was me just sort of mistaking what people were actually saying, or whether it was, I do think there was a bit of, get your ticket to heaven, follow Jesus so that you know where you will spend eternity. But I don't know that I understood the connection of like why the invitation to follow Jesus was actually good for now too.
I keep putting on mute because I've got actually that large animal, this big cat sitting in my
Right.
lap, who's meowing occasionally. So I put myself on mute when I'm not talking. So I'm a former minister. I resigned in 1995, many years ago. But it's always surprising to me how people, especially maybe children who grew up, remember things differently than they actually were. And it's, it's like you come back to a house where you're a kid and suddenly this house is so small when you remembered it being so big. Well, this is almost like the inverse. Suddenly the faith is so big when you remembered it being so small, right?
Yeah.
And I just coincidentally last night on a live show that I did, um, I was referencing Moses and the clarity that I had recently about Moses represented the law. And there was this one minor infraction, that minor infraction where he lost his temper because the Israelites were just beyond the pale, and who could put up with that? And he was only human after all. And he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, and that was a no-no. And so he didn't get to enter the promised land for that one little thing. And it just highlighted how Joshua did get to go in. And Joshua and Jesus are essentially the same name with same etymology, different, because Jesus offers forgiveness, whereas Moses represented the law, and the law is the law, and an infraction is an infraction, and a consequence is a consequence. Break the law of gravity, jump out of a building, you will die. Whereas under Jesus, the law is actually more stringent, right? Even to look at a woman is adultery. With lust in your heart is adultery. And they were like, well, who could get married? And even the disciples said, well, if that's the way it is, it's better off that we not marry, right? At all. Even his disciples came to that conclusion when they learned what the law really entails. But with Jesus, there's also forgiveness, remission of sins. But that's part of growing up and learning the fullness of life and even God's original intent. So when you were explaining this, I was thinking about the serpent who said, oh, did God tell you you're not allowed to eat any of the trees? So the interpretation, the interpretation of what God is saying is this restriction, this limiting, whereas in fact it's an opening, it's an expanding of possibilities. You will do greater works than these, Jesus said, and they won't be the same works, they'll be different. I don't know. I'm just reacting to your story.
No, I think that's really interesting. I think that we do have all kinds of mistaken ideas about the law. The other thing I would say is not only in Christ are we offered forgiveness, but we're actually offered the power to live according to the law, which is for our good. And I can remember a little, we have these like truisms, I guess, that we sort of grew up with. I say we, but maybe this wasn't true for you, but like one of them being something like choose to sin, choose to suffer. And I think there was a way in which, as a child, I thought, choose to sin, choose to suffer, because God somehow is up there with like his, like, I don't know, like stock of inventory of lightning bolts that he's ready to, send down upon the sinners. And so you get this idea that you don't, what you don't understand, and what I understand now is, choose to sin, choose to suffer, because suffering is like, sin is always a suffering. When we walk in congruence with God's commands, when we obey him, joy is actually waiting there for us, and so joy and suffering aren't these just sort of like extraneous things. They're actually inherent to the thing. So joy is inherent to obedience, which isn't to say, that's not to say that, we don't suffer sometimes in the midst of obeying. But I think there's a deep joy in knowing the presence of God, the promises of God, even in the midst of some temporary, some suffering. But I think the other thing about sin is that it's not just that, suffering is a part of God's punishment. It's not just that God's going to visit punishment in my life in the form of suffering. It's truly that his law is meant for our good. If I love my neighbor, for example, as I love myself, that's going to make for some good relationships. If I love God with all of my heart, soul, mind, and strength, then I'm going to love other things in proper relationship to their value. When you think about idolatry, for example, that we can love things in disproportionate ways. If loving my children is good, loving my children so much that they, you know, their love for me becomes an ultimate thing, like that's going to set me up for a lot of disappointment and pain, I would even say, and just in because, you know, those expectations are unrealistic. So that's how I tend to think about it now. But I love the idea of like, yeah, when I thought of faith and discipleship to Jesus as a child, it felt like a cramped space. And I think as a believer in Christ now and someone who's been following him since I was 16, I see the spacious places, you know, that Psalm 16 describes. I think I said age 16, Psalm 16, if I got that mixed up.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to go to a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to learn what you then did with this epiphany post 16. And I'm glad we clarified that. I now know it didn't take you till 30 to get serious about this. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Jen Pollock Michel and her books and her upcoming book on Created in the Image of God.
Philip Yancey's gripping memoir, Where the Light Fell, unravels his transformative journey from a strict southern USA upbringing to a life devoted to grace. Amidst a church portraying God as a stern enforcer, Yancey humorously labels himself in recovery from a toxic experience. Early encounters with contradictions led him to explore through books, challenging his upbringing, and eventually questioning his faith. Yancey's return to faith unfolds gradually, marked by encounters with a world different from his teachings. Resonating with millions through bestsellers like Disappointment with God, his memoir reflects on this journey as a prequel, tracing his evolution from fundamentalism to a life dedicated to unraveling Christianity's deepest mysteries. Brace yourself for a captivating book that promises reflection and inspiration. Where the Light Fell by Philip Yancey. Available now.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God. I'm here with Jen Pollock Michel, and we were just talking about her early years and the 16-year epiphany of expanding in her view on how to approach her walk with Jesus and her walk in faith. So Jen, what happened at age 17, 18, 19 that then led to you studying what you did and writing what you did?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, actually, that we touched on suffering because I hadn't really thought about how it was going to lead into the next phase. But I, like I said, became a Christian at the end of my sophomore year of high school, between sophomore year and junior years of high school. Had wonderful mentorship through my church, through Young Life, and went to Wheaton College. And then my freshman year at Wheaton, in the spring of my freshman year, my dad suddenly died. So here I was, sort of like thrust into like life beyond your control. And I think that I can look back on that now, I mean, like 3 decades later, and see, I mean, I see the pain in a different way than I did then. I mean, I think when you're 18 going on 19 and you suffer, you know, something as sudden and tragic as that, you want to kind of just move beyond it. You don't want to be vulnerable. You don't want people to pity you. You know, I think I really felt like that at Wheaton. Not that people did pity me, but I mean, it was a wonderful community. And when I think about how God very providentially put me in a loving Christian community for my college years, like that was such a gift. But I, you know, kind of wanted to quickly move past it. And I think, honestly, it's been through my writing where I've sort of returned to the early griefs in my life. That wasn't the only early grief in my life. I can get there, you know, basically I married right out of college, married a wonderful man. We met on a missions trip to Africa through Wheaton. I think at that stage of my life, I was wondering whether or not God was calling me into some kind of full-time ministry. And because I was in a tradition that didn't ordain women, I thought, well, I guess I just have to be a missionary. I didn't have a lot of categories for what that would look like. Went on this summer missions trip with the man who is now my husband. And I think, just had to kind of resolve the question, like, I don't know what God has for my future, but I think he's a part of it. So a year after we were married, my brother actually committed suicide. So I, had the early death of my dad when I was 18 going on 19, and then I'm 23, and my brother has taken his life. And I think it's those early griefs in my life truly that helped me to see like the nearness of God in the valley of the shadow of death. And I look at
Was your brother
yeah.
older or younger than you?
Yeah, my brother was older. My brother didn't go to college. We were very different. I think right now, kind of in our moment now, looking back, I could see probably had some sort of diagnosis, like mental health challenges, but probably also just some social and learning challenges that made it difficult for him to find his way in the world. And then there were drugs involved and alcohol, and I mean, just it was a very toxic brew of, pain. I think pain and addiction. But I just experienced God's goodness and God's comfort and God's nearness in like the bottom, at the very bottom of life. Again, like when I'm 23, I'm a new teacher. I was teaching high school French and English. So, you have to kind of keep going. You don't get to stop your life just because you've suffered a terrible grief. And like I said, I think it was in my later writing that I kind of returned to what all of that has meant for my life. But when I think about grief, it's certainly a huge thread in all of my writing. I didn't really expect that I would become a writer. I was a teacher. I started to have children. I quit my teaching role. I wanted to be home with my children. I started to teach a little bit at a community college, started to do some editing. The editing turned into writing. I was doing projects for my church. I started to write for Moody Bible Institute for their monthly devotional. And that kind of led up to the moment where, I had my idea for my first book. And I can get into that. But I think I like to tell this story because I think it can be encouraging for people to know that you don't set out at 23 always knowing, where the path is going to take you and where God's going to lead. He's leading. He's leading into paths of righteousness for his name's sake, but you just kind of follow. And there are twists and there are turns and there are blind corners and there are switchbacks. And so where I am now feels like a great gift of providence.
Well, a couple of thoughts on that. One is that I explained the ethos of this show. What is it that I'm trying to do with created in the image of God? Is that parable of Jesus where there's a woman who has 3 measures of meal. And I had traditionally thought that this was, a loaf of bread, 3 measures, 3 cups. No, 3 measures is 60 pounds, apparently. So she has a large amount of dough. And then she puts leaven in it, but she doesn't. And then once the whole thing is leavened, that's, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like that. But she doesn't put the leaven in there. And no, it doesn't say that she kneads or pounds the leaven. It says she hid the leaven in 3 measures of meal. And you picture this, it's a small amount, it doesn't take much. And you kind of hide it in there. Nobody sees it. So what I imagine or fantasize that I'm doing is uncovering hidden leaven in all these interviews that I do. And the work of God is small. Despise not the day of small beginnings, right? I think it's in Habakkuk about Zerubbabel. Building the temple. It doesn't look like much. It says they rejoice when they saw the plumb line in his hands. Just even seeing the plumb line causes the people to rejoice, right? When you write about the rules for the rest of us or whatever else, it's a piece of that hidden leaven that's going to do its work somehow.
Mhm.
And and the other thought I had along the way is this other verse that is, I think I'm beginning to understand it a little bit better, but it was puzzling when I first really focused on it. Jesus learned obedience through the things he suffered.
Mm.
Why does Jesus need to learn anything?
Mhm.
And why does he especially need to learn obedience?
Mhm.
And why would he have to suffer to learn that?
Mm. I hope you're not asking me.
No, this
Okay,
is
good.
rhetorical questions, right?
Okay, very good. Very good.
What is the sound of one hand clapping, right? It's a
Mhm.
cone. It's something to chew on.
Mhm. Mhm. It's incredible to think about Jesus learning, and I think he had to learn because he was human. I think one of the kind of big themes of probably the last 10 years is accepting how human I am, how human the spiritual life is, and the spiritual journey is. And that means fits and starts, that means limitations, that means confusion and perplexity and learning. I mean, when you think about learning, it's never like, just the steep uphill climb. Like I know nothing and now I know everything. When you truly are learning, you learn something and then it only produces more questions for you to recognize that you actually don't know what you thought you knew previously. And so I am encouraged, I'm just so deeply encouraged that God chose to take on human form to sort of live within the limitations of being human, certainly without sin. But even our limitations sometimes feel like, they feel like a suffering, and they're only, I guess, a suffering insofar as that we are impatient with them. And so I feel like my spiritual journey over the last 10 years has, like, I'm growing more hospitable to being human. And I think that means being more patient with myself, believing far more strongly in the generosity of God's grace, and kind of allowing myself the fits and starts of what even each day can kind of look like.
Well, thank you so much for that. And in terms of this learning experience, was there a progression to the books? Is
Mm.
it more like tacking into the wind? You go to the right for a while, you go to the left. How do multiple books like that unfold? And is it
Mm.
leading you or us or somewhere?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I don't think I'll ever be important enough for people to ask this question, but I think it'd be a fun one for somebody to try to like read and see the theme. The way that I see it is that each book leads into the next one. So the first book is the book that it's just a question that had me really tangled up in the spiritual life. How do we learn how do we deal with desire in the life of faith? I think because of that narrow room I was talking to you about, I always thought desire like there was no space for it, right? I mean, the Christian life, as I understood it, in my early Christian walk was don't want anything, just pray for the Lord's will to be done. And that is, I mean, praying for the Lord's will to be done and wanting the Lord's will to be done is ultimately what we should want. But we have all kinds of other desires and we don't necessarily know what to do with them. And so that first book is about the call and the caution of desire, and truly believing that, no, there's a call to desire, because when you want something, you will pursue it. You will stay committed to it. So we should be seeking that all of our desires, we should be seeking the cultivation of holy desire. So the second book is about the desire for
I,
home. Yeah, go
I,
ahead.
I want to pause you there for a moment because a
Mm.
number of thoughts are coming. One is this. I think I remember from like when I was 8 and had a book on dinosaurs that the Precambrian area saw an explosion of life, right?
Mm.
Now, this is apart from God, it's evolution, whatever. But so going back to the Garden of Eden, when God is explaining creation, yeah, that desire that's inherent in every living thing, there's a kind of desire that
Mhm.
propels it forward, that
Mhm.
leads to self-preservation. And that also leads to diversity, right? Because there's a diversity of directions you can go in,
Mhm.
and God wants that diversity,
Mhm.
right? He wants that diversity. And the other piece to this is that the word desire is a fractal in the early verses of Genesis, because Eve desires the fruit.
Mm.
Then the result is her desire will be to her husband, and he will rule over her. It says this is the consequence. This is that. What did you say? This brilliant phrase, which I've already have forgotten. Sin causes. What was that phrase?
The truism, like choose to sin, choose to suffer.
Choose to sin, choose to suffer, right? So you chose to sin. Here's the suffering you have now chosen. Your desire will shift away from me. You've lost sight of me. You'll turn to your husband and he will rule over you. This is the consequence. But then you have, and she will have pain in childbirth. But the biggest pain that came from childbirth was watching her oldest son kill her younger son. No greater pain than that, right? And then God says, sin lies at the door and its desire is for you. So the same word desire keeps repeating as a fractal. And then in Buddhism, desire is the source of all suffering. So yeah, this is a profound start. But then you fast forward to Paul, and these are all things that I'm learning through having these discussions. You fast forward to Paul, and he says strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. Hearkening back to that tree, her desire to eat of the tree desired to make one wise and to be like God, to know the difference between good and evil. So Paul kind of wraps it up and says, under the new Adam, you better go eat of that tree now with the Holy Spirit and figure it out. It was always going to be a long road to hoe. That was Adam's curse, right? Earth will produce thorns and thistles. In the sweat of your brow, you will earn your daily bread, trying to keep this woman and yourself and everybody else around you happy. And you won't, because no one's turning to me and I'm the source of happiness. They're going to look to you. You're going to try to provide it. You're going to work your fingers to the bone, trying to keep people around you happy. It's not going to work. This is the result. But then along comes Jesus and explains and unpacks the law, adds the element of forgiveness, and says, now go eat of that fruit. And with your senses, by reason of use, discern good and evil. Dig into it now. And now with the Holy Spirit, it will start to make more sense and you can unfold it and unpack it. This is sort of my take on this whole topic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you look at Jesus, and he in Hebrews, it alludes to Psalm 40, I delight to do your will. Oh my God, your law is within my heart. So we think about Jesus, who ultimately always wanted what the Father wanted, didn't actually deny his desire. Or maybe, in the Garden of Gethsemane, you can see the wrestling of desire. There is the human desire to
he expressed his desire to God. He says, hey, I would love for this cup to pass from me. And there again, my fantasy is that he's thinking about Abraham and Isaac. It's like, maybe there's a ram. Maybe you're going to pull a rabbit out of a hat. There's something in the bushes that's going to rescue me from this. And I would love that. Let me tell you, at this point, I would really desire that, is what he's saying.
I'd be good with that plan. There's an ordering of desire that happens in his prayer, though, but not what I would will, but what you would will. So I think the work of reflecting on our desires, being honest with God about our desires, submitting our desires to God, examining them. And then when God gives you good desires, go for them, and we have ways in which we can discern, as you're saying, what are good desires and what are, probably less healthy desires, and what are evil desires. Those certainly exist too. But the second book, is the desire for home. And I think the gospel really does answer our deepest longing for home, and see how fruitful that can be. I think for, whether you're just sharing with your neighbor about the gospel, you're a pastor, you're an author, when you can connect people's deepest human desires with the promise of the gospel, not your best life now, but do you yearn to belong and to be known and to be received? All the ways that we could think about what home actually means. Like, imagine that that is truly offered for you. So that book is so much about my own story of moving around. I moved around a ton, always felt so disconnected from, like, I never really felt like I had a home. And obviously part of that was in my childhood moving, but then in my later, early adulthood, that was grief. That was this idea, like, I'm disconnected from my family members with whom I've grown up. Like, how do I experience home now? And then when you get to the third book, it's about paradox, which is where we have, the both and, home is, for example, both here and later. I do believe there's a way in which we can experience like part of home here on earth through the presence of Christ, in the presence of God's people. And we can also, practice hospitality to others as an expression of the gospel. But ultimately, we know our home is not, we're not experiencing it in its fullness now. So that third book is about, and even desire is a paradox. There's a call and there's a caution. So I just kind of realized sort of in that third book, like, wow, there are a lot of things that require us to hold things in tension. Then, and one of those tensions is that faith is both a gift and faith is a habit, so that's the fourth book, A Habit Called Faith. This idea that, I was very curious because Blaise Pascal has this wonderful quote that I just ran across in a book. And he says, if you are kind of waiting for that mystical experience to convince you that your faith is real, but you haven't had it and you find yourself doubting the genuineness of your faith, just keep going to church. Keep, like, he was Catholic, keep taking the holy water, keep showing up for confession. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. There's a way in which sometimes our emotional expectations, the expectations that we put on faith, like it should feel like this, or it should produce these kinds of like tangible results. Well, sometimes you need to just be encouraged to just keep walking the walk. And so that's about habit. And then the last one is just habits to live better in time, because in the pandemic, I, like everyone else, experienced a kind of time anxiety that I've never felt before. All of my old solutions for dealing with time anxiety weren't working. And then I realized I just need a better story of time. I think that I need to receive time as a gift, but there's a paradox there too. There is this kind of scarcity of time. Mortal life, reveals to us time is scarce. And yet God's given us everything we need, for life and godliness, including the time to do the things that he's called us to do and become the kind of people that he's called us to become. So those are the first 5 books. We can get to the last one later. Oh, I think you're muted again. I'm sorry.
It's amazing to hear you unpack this journey and to be with you on that journey and, sit for a moment with these different phases and perspectives on life. And certainly, I'm sure the audience can relate, because I'm certainly relating to certain experiences and phases in my life. And, there's a natural order to things, right? When we look at the creation, things grow in the same way, right? All the little bunnies go through the same phases. The chickens and the raccoons who are trying to get our chickens, they all go through their same phases. We have chickens and we have raccoons, unfortunately. And this just happens and it recurs, right? And it's the same and it's organic. And this is that divine will, if you will. And yeah, submitting to that and accepting it is so important. And then I think within it, once we do that, once we submit, then we can begin to learn the lessons we're really supposed to learn instead of fighting against it. One of a touchstone scripture for me is this one, that the pot doesn't get to ask the potter, why have you made me thus? Right? And there are all kinds of utensils in service to God, and each one of us has a purpose and a use in his hands, in his kingdom. And when we submit to that, just like when we, going back to the earlier conversation about sin, when we commit sin, we're causing suffering not just for ourselves but for others always.
Yes.
Even this thing, getting back to lust, right? If you lust after a woman, it's going to affect how you treat women. It will. And then it's going to affect how women treat you and how they treat other men. And it's going to affect our perceptions of each other, and the butterfly wings, the butterfly wing of somebody lusting and, whatever over here is going to cause a tsunami over there.
Yeah.
But submitting to the natural order and God's perfect will. And this is, you mentioned the pandemic. Things like the pandemic, climate change, these big societal questions. I mean, I reflect on how we have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation, and today's science, which in a sense, I know this is oversimplifying, science, which in a sense rejects God, has become the new prophet of doom, right? Portraying that these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are riding, the sun will be 10 times hotter, right? And it will destroy all life on earth, right? Gigantic hailstones will fall. You will succumb to diseases. So science is now, the purveyor of doom in the same way that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse was, right? But these are very complex questions, which we're frankly not ready to really solve or tackle. And only through submission to the will of God can we as a society, as a planet, learn how to appropriately tackle some of the challenges that will face us as we move forward as a species. And our own efforts to do so are often wrong-headed and causing more damage than good. I won't go into one way or the other into the debates around COVID and vaccines and climate science and carbon trading and the ins and outs of how we deal with it. First of all, what the problem really is, where the problem's coming from, what the solution to the problem is. But the truth is, if we all submitted to the will of God, we would solve those problems together.
Interesting. Yeah.
But they're hugely complex and they're beyond our current capability to do. We have to grow into the ability to handle these challenges together. And we're not doing a very good job because we're at war with each other over every little thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a good segue into just the last book, which is just, thinking.
Well, then let's quickly go to a commercial break.
Okay, sounds good.
And when we come back, we'll ask the question, where are you growing next, including that next book? Don't go anywhere. Be right back with more of Jen Pollock Michel.
In a world where religions often talk past each other, what if we just sat down and listened? Facets of One is a simple devotional, bringing together scripture from the world's faiths, centered on one truth. God is one. From the Bible to the Quran, from Krishna to Christ, each voice speaks in turn, without argument, without division. You don't have to agree on everything. Just be willing to pray, to listen, and to come together. If you're longing for something deeper than noise and division, this is a different kind of conversation. Facets of One. Many voices, one God. Will you start a circle?
Welcome back to the Created in the Image of God show, where today I'm experiencing time anxiety, a term I hadn't heard before, because we're running out of time and there's so much more I want to learn from Jen Pollock Michel here. But she was about to tell us about her forthcoming book.
Yeah, well, you had just talked about how we seem to be losing the capacity to live well together. And I thought, well, that's a wonderful segue into my next book, A Rule for the Rest of Us, which is really about the personal practice of writing a rule of life. But when you look historically at that practice, it has been a practice that communities have taken up. And they, it's monastic communities, it's monks, it's nuns, and they write a rule, which is almost like their constitution, that's the one way that we can think of it. Like, how are we going to order our life together? How are we going to settle our disagreements? How are we going to grow in our discipleship to Jesus? How are we going to do our work? How are we going to observe the church calendar? I mean, there are all kinds of practical questions, but it really is a document about our guiding values. It's like, what habits and practices will we take up according to our guiding values as believers and followers of Jesus? And it's very interesting when you think about modern people who are very interested in a rule. A lot of their interest is in, how did they do it? How did these communities of people make peace? How did they settle their disagreements? How did they learn to forgive each other? And in my book, I actually kind of examine a little more closely the Rule of Saint Benedict, which is a 6th century document, but it's almost it's as relevant today, I think, as it was really back then. And community is just such a huge theme of it. It really is asking and trying to answer the question, how are we going to get along? How are we going to, and not just get along so that we all enjoy life, but because we follow Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace. How do we actually make daily peace and repair in our relationships? One of the things that Benedict writes about in his rule is he says, well, it's a good thing we're praying the Lord's Prayer all the time, because people are going to need that, constant call to ask for forgiveness from God and to grant forgiveness to their neighbor. I mean, he quite explicitly says it's a good thing. It's a good thing that's in the Lord's Prayer, and it's a good thing that we're saying the Lord's Prayer so many times a day, because we're going to need it. And so there's just an incredible amount of realism, I think, about the challenges of human community. So even though my book is not exactly about how to form that kind of community, I would say that it's about how to form that kind of life so that when you live in community, you have the requisite character, you have the requisite relationship with God that helps you deal with your human neighbors. And I think like I'm yearning for that. And I think other people are too.
Amen to that. Did you at all reference, I'm going to go geek here for a moment.
Okay,
There's a
please.
scroll that was emerged from, I think it was Cave 4 in Qumran, the community scroll. You familiar with it?
No, I'm not. So I did not reference it.
This was revolutionary because here the community at Qumran documented exactly what you're talking about and the rules for how they would live in community life. And this was revolutionary in terms of understanding the evolution of rabbinic Judaism, and also the pattern that was laid down then also for communities within the Catholic Church and other religious groups. And anyway, it's fascinating. And then Jesus, of course, quotes, I think he quotes this, I think it's in the Old Testament, the way of peace they have not known, the way of peace they know not. And so that those sort of practical steps and rules of how to bring about peace, because Jesus himself said, I am not come to bring peace, I am come to bring a sword. He didn't mean that was his intent. He meant this will follow. Right? When you put the new wine in the old wineskins, everything starts to burst and explode, and people don't know, people have a certain set of rules that kind of work for them for a while.
Right.
But then they don't work anymore, and then things fall apart. And we're experiencing that at a societal level right now with the civilization that moved us forward but has its limits, and we're at the breaking point, and we don't understand tolerance. In my own faith community, there are a number of people who like to focus on how we shouldn't other others, but it goes like this: we don't other others the way those other people other others.
Right.
And I'm like, really listen to yourself, right? But how do you actually do that, and how does that actually work, and what's the solution to that conundrum?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what a rule of life, I think, can invite us into, is just a very intentional kind of self-reflection about, our roles, our responsibilities, our relationships, like our actual lives, and what does obedience to Jesus look like in the everyday, and in the relationships that are challenging, in the societal problems that I don't know how to participate in and engage in fruitfully. I mean, we don't ask those questions by accident. In fact, I think that we're really there's a conspiracy out there, right, for our to co-opt our attention. I mean, it's actually like the least secreted conspiracy ever. We know that Silicon Valley is buying and selling our attention, and so we are becoming. It's like amusing ourselves to death, right? Neil Postman's book was that the early 80s, but this idea that we can drift along, we can be
And
distracted.
it was long ago now that we're all dead and we're living in a hellish nightmare. That's how bad it's gotten, right?
Yeah. So the question is, what small step can you and I take today to live a life that pleases God, that, creates, maybe helps to create a stronger social fabric? Gosh, we don't even have to think about just the world. It's not like the world out there is terribly, fracturing, and the church is, safe and unified. Like, we're experiencing within the church everything that the world is experiencing. And so I think we can put the problem out there, we can externalize and blame, and there are lots of forces at work. I don't want to say that that isn't true. But the only thing that I can be responsible for, and the only thing that you can be responsible for, Wade, is just, the limited choices that we can make within the context of our lives. So I think this next book is just asking people to consider what those choices are, to be serious about their responsibilities. And it's just, the responsibilities are just two. Love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the law. The whole law is summed up in that. And it does return us to, doesn't it, to the beginning of our conversation, to think about the law not as a, small and cramped space, but as truly as like the spacious places of our deepest joy, and peace, and encounter with God. So I think to think of it in that way really feels invitational.
Well, wonderful. I think you summed it up beautifully in the time we had remaining.
know, right?
How do people get in touch with you? How do people find your books? How do people get engaged? Is there a program? Is there a group? Is there anything that people, if they want to get involved and do more?
Yeah. Well, you can get the book wherever books are sold. A Rule for the Rest of Us. You can find more on my website, jenpollockmichel.com. If you can spell Pollock and Michel, like, wow, my hat is off to you.
Well, it's right there on the screen visually.
Okay,
so
okay. Very good.
That
Good.
spelling.
Perfect.
Oneword.com, right?
On my website, you can find some registrations for Rule of Life workshops upcoming. The book actually came out of workshops that I'd been teaching for several years to small groups of people. And just that material was really landing with people. And I thought, well, I guess it's time to put it into a book.
Wonderful. Well, any last final words for the audience before we sign off for today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm excited for the conversation and how we ultimately were sort of able in each element of our conversation to remind people, I talked about Psalm 16, which happens to be my favorite Psalm. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence, there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. And I would love for people to consider that serious invitation from Jesus.
Wonderful. And my sign off, as always, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. Do stay tuned for the sneak peek of what's coming up next week. And I will be writing an article on what I learned from Jen Pollock Michel that will be published in the next few days on my Substack. And I hope you will continue to watch, get in touch with our beautiful guest today, and continue to engage with her work. And all the best to all of you. See you next week.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, July 26th at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Richard Strilowich, corporate sage coach and leadership mentor. He reflects on treating work as a spiritual journey and how inner wisdom can shape the way we lead, serve, and grow. From purpose and authentic leadership to discovering God's presence in everyday work and life. And then on Tuesday, July 28th at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Mark Galli, author, editor, and former editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. He explores faith, tradition, and the Christian life, reflecting on a journey that has shaped his understanding of worship, holiness, and the church. From theology and public witness to the enduring pursuit of truth, grace, and spiritual renewal. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, created in the image of